Welcome, one and all, to another episode of the Old Timers Comic Book Show, where the hosts aren't old, although the comics most certainly are. I say they're not old, but of course I had a birthday. If you've been watching MPP, you should know that. So I'm a little bit older than I was. Don't tell anyone. Joining me this time around, as always, is the Professor.
Hi, Johnny. How are you?
I'm very well, very
Happy
well.
Happy birthday.
Cheers, my friend. For my birthday treat, I managed to get my flu jab and my COVID vaccination all in the same day.
Oh, what a
So
gift. The gift that
yeah,
keeps on giving.
yeah. So fuzzy headed today and sore armed is pretty much where I'm at. But other than that, I'm all right. I'm all right.
All right.
So we have no 13th Crusader. He's off. Probably looking for first appearances of books and stuff that he's into. This is,
I think he was too afraid to show up today.
you think, because we're talking scary books. Some books actually that didn't make the grade. Do you have any that you thought, ooh, they're quite scary, but then sort of backtracked a little bit?
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff when we started talking about this theme for the show, more
Mm-hmm.
like a Halloween celebration of horror type stuff. The whole slate of everything Marvel in the '70s. Some of the stuff that came out in Werewolf by Night, Frankenstein's monster, Tomb of Dracula, The Living Mummy.
Yeah,
All those things are a little kind of tropey. A
yeah,
little kind of monster movie-ish type stuff.
yeah.
um Nothing that ever really kind of screamed at me literally about like, oh, like a horror. Nothing that actually
Yeah,
scared me. Some of it is like a little, okay, scary type, but there are books out there that were literally horrifying, right? So
yeah.
just trying to find some stuff to me that tickled that you know
Horror, yeah, the horror
that
vibe.
horror vibe in the back of my head. So
Mm.
yeah, I think we touched a couple of good ones, and
Years ago, my first wife bought me a couple of graphic novels for my birthday, and one of them was the Amazing Spider-Man Wedding trade paperback.
okay, was
Yeah,
that scary?
no, the second book she bought me was this one,
Oh well, there
Arkham
you go.
Asylum, A Serious House and a Serious Earth, Grant Morrison, um, and as is Dave Stevens, absolutely scared the living pants out of me. It
Hmm.
was so dark, so horrific. I had to read the Amazing Spider-Man graphic just to get my mind back. Honestly, you know the pencil gag from the Dark Knight is makes an appearance in this. Bearing in mind this is like I don't know what that 20 years before that probably.
Yeah.
Um, so I think characters like Batman kind of draw horror to them.
Yes.
You're not going to get many horrific Spider-Man stories, although some would say that you know One Day More was horrific for a different reason altogether.
Well, I think comics are one of those unique platforms that you can really kind of get the kind of suspense, the kind of horror. You can really kind of get into all those little parts of your brain. Um, even more so than just reading a book
Mm,
or watching a movie,
mm.
or something that like legit scares you. There's some, I mean, like everybody's scared of something, and
Spiders.
psychologically, I think comics probably translates the best when it comes to some kind of a horror
Okay,
portrayal.
it's not a bad
Um,
shout.
yeah,
We talked about horror, and I think we talked about it before the show. Marvel had that Tales of the Watcher thing going on. And I know this because
yeah,
it always seemed to pop up in the weekly comic books, predominantly Star Wars weekly comic books, which we've talked about before. And it was always like a kind of story with a twist in it, like
yes,
an Alfred Hitchcock type
hmm
type twist. So ones where the guy is like super intelligent, he's the brainiest person in the world. He then decides he's too grand, too big brain to live on this planet.
yeah,
He's off to find a species that he can be with and totally be, and then it turns out that when the planet he lands on, he's turned out that these are like super clever and he's just like a dog to them. And you're like, ah,
Well,
so,
just you think, and this brings you back to Tales to Astonish, where
yeah,
was the first appearance of Hank Pym, and
mm,
not Ant-Man, but Hank
yeah,
Pym, who appeared prior to Fantastic Four 1 and Spider-Man Amazing Fantasy, but he was in an issue of Tales of Suspense where he's Hank Pym and he's fooling around and he finds the ability to shrink himself and he ends up in the anthill. And that's the horrifying kind of thing about being little and having the big monster type
yeah,
creatures chase after you. So to me, yeah, there's always something psychological about these horror books.
mm,
And there is the one that we're going to talk about, I think, first, that uh, you know kind of tells you about all those books that were coming out back in the
mm,
50s that were the form. It was kind of formulaic, right? So they weren't
mm,
all great. They
no,
weren't even all good, but there was always like, here's the character we're introducing, and by the end of this 8-page story, something horrifying and horrible is going to happen to that person, you know,
definitely.
and maybe not until the very last panel of page 8, right?
Mm,
So you might think like they might keep you going through 7 pages, wondering what the heck was going to happen to the character, and then bam, end of the story. And yeah, I thought some of the stories end up being really good and work well that way, and
hmm.
others you can see the story coming from a mile away. So
Yeah, yeah, you can, but that's part and parcel of the charm, isn't it?
sure.
Right, so that brings us nicely, excuse me, excuse me, to our first book. It is EC Comics Crime Suspense Stories. Now, EC Comics, for all those who have not a clue what we're talking about, was a company
Yeah.
that was around in the 40s and 50s, right? But
Yep, that's correct, and very very famously, um, almost single-handedly responsible for the Comics Code Authority being
yeah,
established, due to we were talking. There's so much history that goes into all these horror comics, but one of the biggest historical events that has happened in the history of comics was Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent book that came out in the 50s. More of
mm,
an essay than a book, right? Or kind of a
yeah,
slamming the industry for corrupting the minds of small children. And this particular cover was one of the items of evidence they used at the trial, where they famously put the CEO of EC Comics up on the stand. His name escapes me.
was
Um,
it? I think it was William Gaines.
Yes, that's correct. And yes, and Mr. Gaines was just not the best,
No,
not the best witness to put on the stage. Um,
no,
but this issue single handedly. I mean, and you can look at that cover really kind of pushed the boundaries of anything tasteful. I mean, I think we might even agree on that, right? But
well, I don't know. See,
it would if I was a 6-year-old boy looks like paging through the comics on the newsstand at my favorite grocery store or something, I would not ask my mom to buy this because
no,
I know
I
the
would ask
answer.
my mum. No, no,
So
but I suppose even back in the 50s, it shows that there was different comics for different types of readers then, right? Because I mean,
correct.
50s, there's no Spider Man, there's no Fantastic
Oh
Four.
yeah. Yeah, but I
Uh,
mean, yeah, if you think of everything that Marvel or Atlas was putting out at the time, that's Tales to Suspense, Journey
yeah,
into Mystery, all these stuff, crime suspense stories was coming out from EC, as well as Tales from the Crypt and
DC have
to
Superman, Wonder
horror.
Woman,
Right.
Batman's kicking around,
Yeah.
Justice Society's around. So there's you could argue that EC Comics were the first independent comics companies out there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they were big in everything that was getting published in the 50s, right? So
Mm,
superheroes had largely taken a back seat in the
mm,
50s and were overshadowed by books like this,
mm,
crime suspense stories or police stories or war books from the
mm,
50s, anything that was glorifying any other thing other than superheroes. Really, the
mm.
only superheroes being published in this point in the 50s, you had Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. and nothing else really was hitting. You
Mm.
know, I know that Captain America had a bit of a resurgence, but nothing big. So
Before we get into the book itself, some credits. Predominant writers. This book doesn't come with credits for some reason, so I've had to do some googling on this one. The predominant writers for the title, maybe not this one, but you have William Gaines himself, a bloke called Fieldston, and Craig from 50 to 53. Other writers such as Carl Wessler, Otto Binder, and Jack Oleg. Craig was also the lead artist for the book for the majority of its run, doing both the cover and the lead 8-page story. Normally, I give you a price for these sort of things. Again, Go Collect wasn't that helpful with this. They've got this on there, but they haven't got this particular issue.
I imagine a reprint of this, or the original printing of this book is probably very expensive.
Well, I managed to find a version of this on eBay for £29.
But this is a reprint, right?
Yeah,
the cover.
Could be. Is this a reprint cover?
It's the actual original cover. But if you look at the corner, it's $2.
This is a reprint version of that cover. But what I'm saying is that's serious. All right, okay, cool. So this was your choice. So let's have a quick dive into this and have a look and see where we're at.
Oh yeah, well, just as much as all these stories, they were anthology books, right? So you were getting 4 or 5 stories for the price of your admission. I focused on the very first story, which is the story that's on the cover. And first of all, they're all pretty much formatted the same, with much more focus on the text really than the pictures. This is not a Marvel or a DC book, right? So there's a lot extra story in here as you read from the paragraph, the opening paragraph, and then you get a couple of panels and then some more explanatory stuff. So you could probably get through this with just reading the panels, because the text basically is explaining what you're seeing, really. So that it's a different kind of a storytelling pace, but you have to remember they only have 8 pages to tell the story, which is a good sample size, right? Because you don't want to take 30 pages to get to the twist in the book, right? So anyway, this particular story is really interesting. So yeah, the husband and the wife right at the front page, and you see right from the first panel, right, he has the axe behind his back, and he's gonna murder his wife. Hey, as you do.
As you do on a Sunday. Let's go.
And the whole twist of this issue, well, it's not the twist, but it's the first twist, right? So the right turn, the left turn, rather. So he's been having an affair with a younger woman.
No.
Yes. And
How scandalous.
Get away with murder, so to speak, he is going to he has paid for his younger, let's say, more in shape wife to have plastic surgery so that she looks exactly like the wife he's going to kill. So, and then he's going to live happily ever after with his brand new sexy young wife, which is, yeah. So stay with me here. So he kills his wife, chops her up, and they actually, they leave you without having to guess that, yeah, he chopped her into little bits and, put her in a body bag and buried her in the backyard in a shallow grave. As we come to find out later on, that's probably the foreshadowing for the rest of the book. So, so he buries her in a shallow grave, and then he goes to the city, gets his nice new lovely wife, and they start living it up on the town, and end up getting tickets to go see a new game show called Treasure Hunt. And they get to they actually get their names called, and they get to go down and be contestants on the show, and they get to the final round of the treasure hunt game, where they have to go find out where the buried treasure is. And they find out that as we speak right now, the game show is burying something in your backyard, and that's how the story ends. I thought it was really kind of a twisty, amazing, kind of little scary thing in the end, and that's how most of these stories end, right? With
Right.
that you kind of know that their goose is cooked, but
Yeah.
some they don't show it. They don't have to, right?
Nah.
But let me tell you what these stories, and a lot of these I read several of these stories. I read this whole issue, but several of the stories, and you know what it reminds me of? Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
A little,
Yeah.
little bit of Poe, a little bit of Telltale Heart. I thought a lot of those stories were along the same lines where they they think they got away with it. you know,
Well, go away with the truth, was you pesky kids.
yeah. So I mean, even the second story, if you think about that, they, it's like they're going to get away with murder, or they're going to get away with a crime, or they're going to get away with something, and then in the last page you find out, whoops, not getting away with it. We found out, and that's I think really almost like the visceral fear I think we all have a little bit, right? Where
Yeah.
maybe
Waiting for
getting
the other
found
shoe to
out.
drop. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So everybody's, like that anxiety of someone's going to find out something,
Yeah.
So that kind of that whole story, that whole feeling resonated with me. The second story was pretty good too, where the uh, the banker the banker has to go and take care of this older woman, bring her her money every week,
Hmm.
and he realizes that he can get away with just writing an extra zero on there and giving her $50 and stealing 500 for himself, or 450 for herself, and he starts living it up on the town with her money, and then she passes away, and he realizes he's probably going to get caught, and so they come to check on him. They come to ask him questions, and he jumps off the building and kills himself. And then they were like, "Oh, we were we were coming over to tell you that the little old lady left you everything because she liked
Yeah.
you so much." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, you know."
Ah.
So
So, yeah. Oh, look at that. Look at that. 9 panel page, even back in the 50s. Who'd have
yep,
thunk it?
yep. And we didn't see any of his art in this issue, but Wally Wood has been he was one of the big EC artists of the 50s, and he was he's one of my favorite old timer artists. So,
Well, it's funny you bring Bollywood up because I was going to mention that the art in this first story is quite salacious in certain light. I
mhm.
mean, she's a buxom woman to start with,
Yes,
and even when she gets, I mean, she looks great. She's drawn great. The figures work really well, posturized and body poses and stuff. Even here, when she's lying on the bathroom floor, it's quite a, she's quite a curvy
she's
person.
curvy. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that kind of um, resonates with the reader as it always has, but also as one of those nails in the coffin that Wortham was going to bring up.
yeah,
That the girls always look at. Bollywood is famous for drawing sexy women. You
yep.
know, so we've talked about Bollywood loads, and you're absolutely right. But you got to think back to the 50s. You've got to, in the cinema, it was all those B movies like The Silent Earth, monster movies,
Yep.
science fiction movies with all the prize. What I find ironic is the horror for me isn't that they're going to get caught out. The horror is he's got another girlfriend on the side, and the girl loves him so much she's willing to get her face done like the girl he's just been killed. I,
Yep,
I'm like, what?
yep.
That tells you something about the society that was treating women back in the 50s. Yeah,
Yeah,
they
and
would do
there are
anything for their blokes.
a lot of stories that come out of, some of them were formulaic, and some of them
Yeah.
were the same story, just retold a different way.
I,
So,
and we can diss it now and say, oh yeah, women, equal rights and all that sort of stuff, which is true.
yeah.
But we've got to remember this book is, as we say loads of times, it's of its time. You can't go back and vilify it. It's happened,
Well,
So
that's the other thing that I was thinking too, because this is kind of really like a tale of two lifetimes, right? Because
right,
we are no longer in an era of a comics code, right? So the
yes,
only thing that's stopping anybody from publishing another story, something like this, is just common decency and taste. And if what what if someone were to come out with books like that today with a story like that, with a cover like that. You know,
I think
that
maybe.
wouldn't happen today, right? Would it?
I don't know. I don't know. I think there's room on the rack if you can. It obviously has to match, the the zeitgeist of the readers. So the fact that if there's a modern EC, for example, there's no telling. It's no telling if it would be the wife that's trying to kill the husband, because the wife wants to end up with another woman, or the husband wants to end up with another man, or the man changes it gender to be with another. It's like the world is that open now that you can kind of take that story anywhere. You
That
mentioned comic code. I
maybe
will
we
say I'll ask you a question about the comic code.
sure.
Do you think the introduction of the comic code was a good thing from a creative process? Because writers and artists had to become cleverer to get the story out. Or do you think it was bad all over?
I think and of course we both love Silver Age,
Me
DC and
too.
Marvel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and yes, they did have to become more creative, but I think a lot of the times they became even more formulaic, especially if you read some like early DC, Silver Age DC, where
Mm-hmm.
they couldn't have actual villains paying the price. So every other issue was the alien from another planet because
Mm.
you could you could get away with the alien from another
Yeah.
planet and doing stuff because they weren't human, right?
Yeah.
So that was, I think, DC's big falling in that early Silver Age points. But then I think when they relaxed the comics code a little bit, they kind of got like that's when you started getting from Marvel. You started getting
Mm.
werewolf. You were able to show werewolves and vampires.
Mm.
That's, believe it or not, with this the comics code was that strict back in the '60s that you couldn't have horror. You couldn't have zombies or
Nope.
vampires or werewolves or any kind of horrific monster like that. Aliens were fine, but you couldn't
Mm-hmm.
have other like monsters like that, and then you couldn't depict drug use. And if you remember, there was three those Amazing Spider-Man issues where Harry had substance abuse.
Yep.
Those were published without the comics code on them.
Yep.
So I mean that was a very famous snubbing of the comics code because Stanley
Definitely.
thought the story needed to be told.
So it's funny because you talk about things like what wasn't allowed back then.
Yeah,
That's why Morbius wasn't a vampire; he was a living vampire.
right.
To get past that sort of stuff. Who else was I thinking about? They said at one point that Wolf, you couldn't have the word Wolfman on the
Mhm.
cover. Because if your name was Marv Wolfman and you were the guy that wrote the book, there you go. Name's
Right,
on the cover now.
right.
Um, no, the comic code, I never thought about it when I was reading comics back when I was a kid.
No,
And I don't really think about it now so much when I'm buying back issues or filling gaps in my collection and stuff. Do I think that the code hindered comics and storytelling? I think the code helped keep youngsters coming into the comic book industry, to be fair, because parents would know that, oh, you know what, you can read this comic. I don't know. We talk about no 6-year-old back in the 50s was going to read crime suspense stories. I'm not sure I'd let a 6-year-old read a Batman comic right now. Yeah.
and that's true.
And that's
That
why the publishers, DC particularly, are doing like young adult books and kid friendly books because
yeah,
they know that the current product isn't fit for purpose. When we were kids, we were 6-year-old, 7-year-old. We were reading Batmans and Supermans and Spider-Mans. We wouldn't read the X-Men because that was just a little bit too adult. But Avengers, all that sort of stuff we were reading.
well, I think the comics code is being established paved the way for superheroes to come back and be more prevalent and more, more for
Mm,
for the superheroes because that was it was an easier pill to swallow, I guess, right?
mm.
So
Yeah,
you
interesting.
look back, well, if you look back at the '50s and look at the stuff that they were publishing back then, I don't think any of those books would they
Yeah,
really fell out of favor fairly quickly once the superheroes took over again.
yeah, definitely. All right, time for a break for one of our ads. Should we talk about monsters? If we talk about Halloween and we talk about monsters, there's only one thing to say, isn't it? Who are you going to call?
I don't know the answer.
There you have it. Ghostbusters, of course. What's the famous one from
Hey.
Ghostbusters? Marshmallow Man. There you go. It's Crisis in the Toyverse. One of our favorite ads, one of our favorite shows. And Bobo,
Yes.
he is an absolute legend. He's a legend massively. If you want to talk figures and statues with Bobo, you're in rare company indeed. Excellent. All right. So our second book is actually, this is a creator we're going to talk a lot about. It's funny when we talk about comics that kind of were, were horrific or shocked us back in the day. Because I
Yeah.
was going to also mention the Killing Joke, just for the pure craziness that happened, the horror of what happened to Joker's wife, the horror that happened to Batgirl, and all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, the ambiguous ending that's come more into the limelight a little bit, written by Alan Moore. And of course, you've gone for this peach of a book. Where is that? Boom, there you go. So this is From Hell. This is the master edition that I've used, written by Alan Moore with art from Eddie Campbell. What details have I got for you on this one? Give me a sec. My notes. Right. This is from 1991. Go collect. Have issue 1 at $26. It's not bad going, is it? Yeah.
It's not that bad.
You can still get it on eBay for less than £3 if that's the thing. Excellent. So, talk to me about From Hell.
Yeah, well, when we started, like I said, we came up with this idea to do like a scary Halloween type, episode, and my personal fear, or what kind of gets me, is the fear that is drawn from realism, right?
Oh,
And
okay.
so stuff that maybe some true life crime, suspense, horror, and what
Mm-hmm.
more horrifying incident can I think of than like Jack the Ripper, right? The what do they call him, like the first serial killer, you know?
Yeah.
And and this whole story kind of resonated with me. I didn't know when I picked it up at first, like I didn't really know about Jack the Ripper much.
Mm.
I knew he killed a few prostitutes in England back in the 1800s, and he was never caught. And so, when you just think about it, it just kind of feels like, oh yeah, he just got away with it, and it
Yeah.
was something that no one really thought about. But then I saw a documentary on Netflix, and so stuff that they actually had like crime scene photos and stuff like
Mm.
that. Because if you think, 1888, that was, there was camera photography back then, and this was probably really the first time that they'd really kind of done any kind of forensic uh, upkeep of crime scene photos, right?
Mm-hmm.
You
Right.
know, so again, didn't really do a lot for me to actually figure out. Like, I never really thought of who was he really, right? Because they never caught him. So I just kind of thought he was just like one of those phantom type serial killers, like Jason or Freddy Krueger or whatever.
But he's a real dude. It
But he's a
really
real dude.
happened.
Yeah, but in this book, Alan Moore actually goes into the who was he really,
Mm.
and actually took a lot of a lot of the information from this book, because he does say it's historically factually accurate, but there he does fictionalize some of it, right?
Yeah.
So obviously Alan Moore doesn't know who killed who killed all these women, but it's an interesting read, and I think it's an interesting read from beginning to end, especially with, you start off right at the beginning
Mm-hmm.
knowing who Jack the Ripper is. Jack the Ripper is Doctor or Sir William Gull, who is the royal physician to Queen Victoria.
That is one of the most prominent theories behind who Jack the Ripper was. Even now,
Right,
yes.
right, he dives right in to all of these different characters. Of course, all the victims are characters in this book, and they get into the Freemasons and the exact reasoning behind why all these women were killed, because it turns into a more insidious type of plot, instead of just a random "I'm killing prostitutes." Now I'm the royal physician covering up the existence of a illegitimate royal heir.
Again,
And
another historical theory for the royal family, more than
right.
once.
And it's kind of funny, and I actually was really interested in talking to you about it, because you're way more close to the whole royal thing than I am. But as far as the whole ideas of all of it, like while I was reading it, I was like, wow, this seems like a really well thought out theory.
Mm-hmm.
you know
Mm-hmm.
and then reading it, like reading it unfold and watching like William Gull kind of losing his mind slowly over, figuring out like he's going to kill these women. He has his driver is a willing accomplice,
Mm-hmm.
and then having the introduction of Inspector Aberline, who is really kind of the foil in the book trying to solve the murders.
Yeah, the
And
Sherlock to the Moriarty.
right. And then it has I think resonance today, as he figures it out, he knows who it is, he goes to the police, and the police are like, "Oh yeah, we know. We're covering it up." you
Yeah,
know. And
yeah, because the truth would hurt more than the crime, I guess.
yeah, well, the
Would
truth
it?
would hurt the royal family, and
Yeah.
we can't have that institution having that black mark
Mm.
on them. So, of course, no one cares about the prostitutes. So, they're like lost souls anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, they can kill them in the most horrific manner that you can imagine, which is depicted graphically in this book, I
Yeah.
might add, which is part of the reason that this is such a horrifying book to me, is
Mm.
because they didn't spare any of the details,
Mm.
and they went very much into the detail of how he killed these women and what he did to the bodies,
Mm.
which is horrifying in itself.
Fair point. Fair point.
Yeah.
It's 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 an interesting read because, as you say, it pulls all these separate theories and then pulls it into like kind of one event or one set of events that link to each other.
Yeah.
Um, do I? Are you asking me what I know about the royal family? Is I know as much as the next person. To be fair, I'm not a huge royalist in any shape, way, or form. But I do know that every family has secrets,
Yes.
and no matter
But
how royal or non-royal you are, there are going to be some skeletons in closets. Um, the royal physician thing does make a lot of sense when you think about what was done to the women and how they were murdered. Which again, as you mentioned, is graphically shown in here. So this book is not for the faint-hearted,
no.
as you'd expect with Alan Moore's name on it. But Alan Moore, as a writer, he tends to draw from lots of different areas to create a bigger whole. If you look at the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, for example, he's using Quatermain, he uses Mina Harker, he uses all these different literary characters to tell a story, pulling them all together as if they existed all at the same time. Maybe not as horrific as this, but that's what he does. And this is kind of, I suppose, the element of that pulling the strands together elements. And there's loads of writers that are really good at that.
Yes.
Peter David, for one, if you like Star Trek, he's great at pulling like little subplots from different episodes to give like a new story. Again, not as horrific as this, but still. The art works really well. I think when this book came out originally back in '91, there was a whole movement towards this style of art.
Yes.
You had things like Batman Legends of the Dark Knight, which was a little bit more easier on the eye, a little bit more simpler
That
pencil.
was I remember that Gotham by Gaslight story.
Yeah, Gotham by Gaslight, which again was a Jack the Ripper story. Fantastic by Mike Mignola and Craig Russell. You've also got things like Sandman Mystery Theater from Vertigo, which again had this style of old world art depicting old world things. So it was quite on point, quite for this, definitely. I enjoyed reading the book for what it was. I like the font, the letters does my head in. I'd rather it to be more simple. But you know,
so some of it actually, some of it was like I couldn't even read some of it. Like it was a little bit muddy. But it was it lent itself to the language that they were using too.
Agreed.
It was
I mean the font they use is the issue, but it fits that kind of era where the handwriting or writing wasn't as polished as it is now. Although if you see my handwriting, it's not that polished. But no, it totally fits with the style of the book that we're going for. Just makes it hard for me to read. But I'm sure Alan Moore doesn't care if I can read it or not.
I do have to say that the version that I have is the black and white edition, and I haven't seen it in color. So
do you like it in color?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine there's a lot of red later on.
I imagine so. Yeah. The black and white version made the lettering even more muddy to tell you the truth. So, but interesting. Interesting.
Look at that! It's perfect. Actually, I love that.
Yeah. The colorists they did some good job after the fact. So
excellent. So there you go for your Jack the Ripper aficionados from Hell. Also spawned a movie, if I'm correct.
You are correct. A movie starring Johnny Depp back in the early '90s, and the movie was should I say loosely based on on this. So
loosely based. Hashtag had the same name.
Yes. Yeah. There were a couple like they kind of mashed because Johnny Depp in the book in the movie plays Inspector Aberline, and in the book Inspector Aberline goes to see a psychic who who is the one the psychic is the one that says William Gull is Jack the Ripper, and and of course that kind of lends a little excuse there for Alan Moore to say, well, it was a psychic that said it was William Gull, even though he's portrayed on the page as actually being the murderer. But in the movie, they mash both of those characters, and it's Inspector Aberline that's actually getting the visions. Which is it's a very roll your eye moment. So the movie's not really great.
I hate when that happens. I hate when they do like a really, really good setup, and you think, "Oh, this is going to be great," and then they just go out of left field and jump the shark. It really annoys me.
When you read From Hell, when you read Alan Moore's book, I look at that and saying, "Oh, this would make a great movie," but then why do you have to mess it up when you make it? Just make what he wrote.
Yeah, just make a goddamn movie, man. Yeah. For those of you that are interested in Gotham by Gaslight, there is a DVD out or Blu-ray of the same title. It's not as atmospheric as the Mignola book. However, it's more steampunk Batman than it is Gaslight Batman. Is it worth a watch? Yeah.
That's DC animated?
No, I don't think so.
No?
No, I quite like Hush.
Oh, okay.
I like Hush. It's up there. It's up there, definitely. I think
No,
my
but I
top.
mean, it's from the animated
Oh
side.
yeah. Sorry, it is the animated. Yeah, you're right. Sorry. So for me, it's I'd go Hush, that, Year One, but then I love Year One anyway. So it's fine. Right, my choice. So I went a little bit back to my roots, literally.
It's funny how we both pick Alan Moore books, though.
Yeah,
It's a little weird.
it is, but that just tells you something, doesn't it? That if you want a horror, if you want a thought-provoking book, where you going to
Yeah.
go? Yeah,
Yeah.
you're not going to go Rob Liefeld or Scott Lobdell, are you?
No, you're not.
Right, let's get this drawn in there. This is Saga of the Swamp Thing, Volume 2, number 21. Already alluded to, it is written by Alan Moore, art by Steve Bissett and John Totleby, which took my spell check ages for me to write. Colors are by Tijan Wood, and letters are by, is it John Costanza? Is that right? Or John Costin in this? Let's have a look. It's only on the first page. Oh yeah, Costanza, I was right. Excellent. Again, my spell checker has done me in. Right, so why did I pick this book? Swamp Thing's been around for ages. And now, before we get into the book, I want to talk about the misrepresentation of who did what. All right? Does that make sense?
Please educate me, Johnny, please.
So when people say Swamp Thing, they talk about Alan Moore. And that's all well and good because, he did revolutionize the character. And we're going to talk about how he did that in a little bit. But he was actually created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. And people seem to forget that. It's kind of like how people misappropriate things. Like when Stan Lee died, the BBC did a whole article about how he created the Marvel Universe, including Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, and Captain America. He had absolutely nothing to do with Captain America other than put him on the Avengers.
Right.
And people say, well, Claremont created Wolverine. No, he didn't. He might feature him in the X-Books, but he didn't create him. Again, Len Wein. So I kind of think that there's lots of areas where people tend to get, or characters get, misrepresented from the creators, and there's just a couple off my top of my head. When people think Swamp Thing, they think Alan Moore, and they should, because he, as I said, but shout out to Len Wein in the first place and Bernie Wrightson, right? I mean, you want horror books, you need to look at Bernie Wrightson's art.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yep. He's a classic.
I remember having this Batman annual. It was Batman Swamp Thing. And Batman's cowl was hung on a skeleton sat down. And he had the really long ears, and it scared the living pants out of me. I was like, nope, not reading that. Eventually I did. Can you think of any more characters that get misrepresented?
They get misrepresented from
their creators,
who actually created him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a ton of them out there, but you did the major ones: Wolverine, Captain America. I think the X-Men. Dave Cockrum doesn't get nearly as much credit for creating them as Claremont does.
Yeah, especially the second generation. The Storms, Nightcrawlers. So they're all his creations. Yep, spot on. Good shout. All right, so why this book? Well, originally, Swamp Thing. The way it worked out was that Alec Holland was washed in swamp goo and ended up becoming Swamp Thing. That was the original story. That's horrific to start with, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This book, on the other hand, takes it a totally different way. We find out that Alec Holland actually died in the fire, and it was his consciousness that kind of was his body that was eaten by the swamp and then inhabits the swamp. So Al Holland doesn't actually exist anymore. It's a monster that thinks it's human, not the human that thinks it's trying to be. And this kind of just set the book in a totally different direction.
Mm.
The art is grimy, it's gritty, there's lots of lines going on. This is pre-Vertigo, all right? So if you're talking about what Vertigo meant to DC, their longest, I suppose, running books in Vertigo were Sandman, Swamp Thing, and Animal Man. Yeah. Swamp Thing was the mainstay, absolutely. Is the book read wordy? God, yes. Of course, it's Alan Moore. Of course, it's wordy. But you get to see the story. It plays out. You get introduced to the characters. Floronic Man's in this, or the start of the Floronic Man is in this. Practically the only thing that's missing from this is the green, although that comes in later on. It's a really good retake. We talk about how reboots or restarts can affect a character.
Yeah.
And this works. This works for this character. Because before, Swampy was getting to the point where, you know what? He was just a superhero that lived in the swamp. And he needed something to differentiate him because, you know, you've got Man Thing from Marvel, who came out just a couple of months before Swamp Thing first appearance. So, I don't know, I absolutely enjoyed this book. I've got this as a trade paperback, the Saga of the Swamp Thing, from this point onwards, rather than the stuff beforehand. And I think that just kind of carries that through. Modern day, you've got the green, you've got he's been able to transmit his thoughts into the plants all over the place. You've now got a plant, as you'd expect in today's world. You've got a plant society, whether it be Floronic Man, Swamp Thing, Poison Ivy, all have some sort of, I'm not saying some dirty plant threesome, but they do have relationships with each other. They all impact each other from that point of view. I just think this is really well done. It's a really good reimage of a character that was losing its way and become more mainstream, and then led to the birth of a whole side universe for DC. There you go. Cool. What did you think of this book?
So I think what you had already brought up was, I think it's almost a little bit understated of how well a retcon can work, right? Without it, I mean, with this is a retcon, and you never really think about it, right? The only twist that they do is Alan Moore says, well, you know, you thought that it was Alec Holland that became one with the swamp, but instead it was the swamp that became one with Alec Holland. And that's it. Yeah. That's it. You know?
Yeah. And that one little, it's like a light switch, isn't it? It's like, it's like a light bulb moment. It's like, oh, of course, why not?
Yeah, but that's just a small, tiny change. Doesn't change any of the stories that happened before, and has every effect on the avenues that you could take with Swamp Thing going forward. You know, and that brilliance on the hand of Alan Moore there. You know, and everybody, you know. Everybody does remember Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, but you know that he comes and does Watchmen, which is, you know, probably his best known work, right? And then of course he does From Hell, and then, you know, he does a couple of other things for DC, but he's mostly a recluse now, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. He's absolutely, he won't. He doesn't promote any of his work with DC doing like any sort of. So he did no promo work for the Swamp Thing TV show. Didn't do any promo work for the Watchmen movie or the Watchmen TV show.
In fact, disowned them, right?
Disowned
Watchmen.
Him and DC. Well, he hates DC right now. So, but when you think about Alan Moore and the work, just the body of work, you know, you're talking The Killing Joke, you're talking Swamp Thing, Watchmen. All these books have had an impact on other things. I mentioned Swamp Thing creates practically the Vertigo universe.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much where it was. You know, you think to yourself, I want a series of books based on mature characters where I can get away with doing stuff that I can't do normally. They're not quite superheroes, but the dark characters. So you've got Constantine and Hellblazer, Animal Man, Doom Patrol, all these books. All of them stem from the fact that Alan Moore turned Swamp Thing from superhero to a monster.
Yeah, it's just and the influence that Alan Moore has had on other writers like Grant Morrison
Mm,
and Warren Ellis and some of
mm,
the others, these writers that aren't afraid um, to come up with new concepts and new ideas and make you think differently about the characters that you're reading and what's possible on the
mm.
comic page, right? Because
Agreed.
they really break new ground. I mean, if you've never read a Grant Morrison book, if you've never read a Warren Ellis book or or an Alan Moore book, they're
Mm.
just their ideas that leap off the page are just not your typical superhero fare, right?
Yeah,
They're
I agree.
so
Grant Morrison can be a bit of an acquired taste, admittedly, but you're right in what
that,
you're saying. These great ideas come off, and sometimes it's an uncomfortable read.
yeah.
Parts of Watchmen, for example, are an uncomfortable read,
Well, I mean,
but it's
and
supposed to be uncomfortable. That's the point. It's not a tame world that Alan Moore writes in. He
well,
writes in a world that has this darkness just under the surface.
and didn't like the whole reason he left Swamp Thing was because of a story that he wrote about Jesus Christ, right?
Right.
So that,
So
I mean, that to be able to boldly go um, and want to express yourself uh, at to that level of what you can do
mm,
on a comic, that to me, maybe DC just was too small for him. You know what I mean?
you know what? That's not. You know what? That's not a bad idea when you think about that. You know, the comic code, DC.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. You've got these creators out there that are just pushing boundaries, and I suppose that's what makes the indie market so well versed is that you can take your ideas and do something different like that. But
Now, and maybe you know better than me about what he's done recently, but I think you know from Hell was he self-published that, right? Or
yeah,
he
yeah, it went to an
so
indie book. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Has he done anything recently?
I don't think so. I think the last thing I heard he was doing some sort of book for, and this was gone back a while. This is a book for Image where we had lots of literary characters kind of um, get intimate with each other. I don't think I've seen his name. I don't think I've seen his name anywhere on anything. I think he's very much recluse. His daughter writes, Leah Moore, she writes for Dynamite at times. So there you go. Cool.
Interesting.
Excellent. I could read something forever. All right, but we're not going to. We're not going to. There you go. So for a Halloween special, you've had 3 different types of horror from 3 different types of publishers. What more could you want? That's
There you
great,
go.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent. Whatever your horror vibe is, make sure you have a good, safe Halloween. Don't eat too much candy, kids. Yeah, you'll put on
If
weight, your teeth will fall out.
if your parents are good, they'll go through your stash and take all the good stuff and leave
Yeah,
you with
and don't read
the.
comics with sticky fingers. Hmm.
Oh, that goes without saying.
Well, you'd think, right? You know, you just see some kid going, "I've got the new issue." Yeah, okay, whatever. All right,
It's
Professor.
not usually that's not usually why my pages stick together.
I don't know. Oh my god. All right, so
Kid-
don't forget to check out the new CPM for all your favorite shows, including Professor.
No Prize Podcast, all about the MCU, Disney Plus, and we do manage to squeeze some comics in there and talk comics.
Cool, cool. Of course, you've got TDC, the Definitive Crusade, for all your DC news, paraphernalia. I'm sure the guys and gals will be having a chat around good old Black Adam, which is in the cinemas now. There you go. Interesting.
Yes.
See how that goes. Professor, thank you so much for spending the time.
Oh, thank you, Johnny, as always.
As always.
Fun time.
Fun time. I've been your host, Johnny Machine Hughes, and as always, adios.